Right, workshop. Hello, my name is Roel. I'm from the Netherlands, and I've been asked to give a workshop on contextualization. The reason I want to do the workshop on this topic is maybe a lot of frustration when judging debates or being in debates myself, when I feel that the team with the best analysis or the best ideas didn't necessarily win the debate because the judges couldn't credit them to the extent they want to. I think in many cases that lack of credit is due to false contextualization or false characterization of certain groups or trends or an actor. And I think making teams aware of this will actually make sure that analysis goes better. I made a PowerPoint presentation. I will upload it later, but I will also upload it already to make sure that people who would like to read along have the opportunity to do so. I will also edit the PowerPoint later to put some exercises in there, which you can do yourself with your team partner to actually make sure you understand what I'm getting at and to apply it. I'll post a link in the description of this live stream, if that works. So now the link should be in there. In case you have any questions or like to elaborate on something, please let me know. There should be a live chat next to the video where you can ask these questions. I will check that and make sure everyone can actually ask the questions. Cool. Please let me know. There should be a live chat. It should be muted. Cool. All right. Let's start. So, as you can see in the context slide, this is the first part of the presentation. There are a couple of things I want to look at. First, I want to talk about the specific I mean when I talk about contextualization or characterizations, why I think they matter and what the use is. Then I want to talk about what to contextualize, and we'll basically identify three broad categories there in terms of contextualization. I will then explain how for each of the contextualizations you should be able to categorize. The last part is are some other things to keep in mind when it comes to contextualization in debate. I think there's one important thing to note at the beginning, and this is a skill more than a piece of knowledge. So I think there are plenty of excellent workshops, for example, on the rise of the extreme right, on the sort of phenomena, where you watch them and internalize the knowledge, and that's mainly the thing you can get out of the workshop. However, this kind of workshop is mainly a skill. I want to make you aware that it's a useful skill to have, and I want you to be able to practice the skill. But it means the workshop should be seen more as a starting point or a broad education rather than having creating knowledge you should keep with you. That's also why I'm putting in a lot of exercises. If you have any questions or you've done an exercise or you'd like to know more about it, please contact me. I'd love to chat about it. I will put my email in the presentation, but you can also just approach me over Facebook and it should be fine. So the first category, contextualization and characterization, what are they and why do they matter? So I think the first thing is in terms of technology. I think there's some subtle difference between contextualization and characterization, but other people are much more qualified to discuss the nuances about it. I'm mainly going to use them interchangeably because I don't think there's a structural difference, but I do think people refer to both and they mean the same thing. Proving, showing how that they are that way. Why would you do that? Well, a couple of reasons. For one, I think it makes debate significantly less messy. Often, as a judge, you have massive issues because all teams have arguments and all teams have a completely different conception of the world. And this might be feedback that is relatively familiar. I think being very aware that often is the case and being very aware of the different contexts and understanding that they make the argument significantly better is a very easy way to solve that and makes it better. I think the second thing is, and I will highlight the issues where it is, it often makes analysis much more credible. In the sense that often mechanisms can only be bold when you believe a certain conception of the world or are much more plausible if you use this conception. Of course, it also means that you can use it excellently versus rebuttal, saying this will be a great argument in a great analysis in the vacuum, or if you buy their characterization of the world, however, we will provide you with a counter characterization, which means that the analysis is basically false. This is also why I think that context and characterization is incredibly useful in the second half of the debate. It's a very easy way to frame out of the debate. Saying, look, we have this bunch of mechanisms, you're not going to deal with them one-on-one, but you're going to spend some minutes on giving you a certain perception of the world, a certain characterization, and then explain why that's the right one, and so frame the whole debate out to make yourself more credible. I think the last reason why you could actually do it is to make judges care more significantly about impacts. When you help them a certain group, explaining why that's the most important group or the group that should be helpful for, why that's definitely the crucial thing. So those are, I think, the main reasons why you could categorize. I included examples in all of these categories. All of these examples are from Tallinn Euros last year. One of the reasons I did that is to show that I think in pretty much every debate, contextualization is relevant, but it also makes sure there's plenty of room for opportunity and it makes it easier. Cool. So I think following from these reasons to contextualize, there are roughly speaking 3 kinds of categories that you can categorize, and I think they are relatively different. I think the first thing you can talk about is the thing that the motion evaluates. So, for example, certain trend or certain phenomenon. Examples include here. Examples including here is, for example, the rise of the sharing culture, which was a motion last year, which you obviously need to talk about what the sharing culture is. The second thing is certain actors that your argumentation partly relies on. So, for example, you can talk about teachers and they will cooperate with a certain policy or what they're currently doing, but you can do the same with the police or the army or school children or pretty much any kind of these categories. That's the second thing. The last thing is specific groups you're helping: women, LGBT individuals, poor people, all the kinds of vulnerable individuals. Roughly speaking, those are the 3 categories I want to help you categorize with. So let's dive into the first one, the trend. So the 2 examples I included here is this house regrets the rise of sharing culture, which is a very clear example of a trend. And the second one is this house supports the creation and use of lethal autonomous robots, which doesn't intuitively seem like a trend, but is of course a certain new development that you need to evaluate. How do you characterize that? Roughly speaking, I think there are 2 very easy things to keep in mind. Of course, there are plenty multiple ways to do it. But to keep it simple, these are the main 2 I want to talk about. The first is who creates this, who caused this trend, and why did it do so? So, for example, when we look at the first motion, this house regrets the rise of sharing culture. I think on prop, you're mainly going to talk about peer pressure and how people who don't really want to have a Facebook account, for example, or don't really want to partake in that sharing culture, almost have to because of a massive social pressure and because everyone is doing that. On the other side, you're going to talk about that people actively opt into it, do it because they get lots of positive things out of it. And which of the 2 makes their characterization more intuitive, more plausible? I think it's a very good shot of winning the debate. So it's the first thing you're going to do. Who creates this? Who is actually participating in this? And why are they directly doing that? With the second question, this house supports the creation and use of lethal autonomous robots. I think an opposition is mainly going to talk about how people simply want to have lower costs on welfare, and for example, talk about dictators and why they are going to invest in these kind of robots to make oppressing their people even easier and even more low cost. Whereas the other side is going to talk about, look, this is mainly about people who want to have war for the right reasons, want to do a proper intervention, and want to do so in a safer and directly better way. I think the first important thing to note is that obviously, in almost all of these cases, there's a certain amount of truth in both situations, given the fact that there are almost multiple people participating in a trend, or multiple calls on something, and some of them might be good and some of them might be bad. I think the main thing is to acknowledge it, and there will be more about weighing off different kinds of characterizations later. But don't just acknowledge it, but also explain where yours is more important, where you're likely, or yours is the more important one. So from those examples, I think there are a couple of things you can generally look at. I think proper consent is almost always an important one. So also, whatever the trend is, whatever the thing is you can discussing, I think at the moment you show that people, regardless of whether they want to, have to participate in a trend and have to partake in something even though they don't want to. That's a very good way of showing that's probably a negative thing that we are evaluating. And the same goes for accountability. At the moment you show that a certain development leads to complete kind of unaccountability. So for example, that the people deploying these killer robots aren't properly being held accountable, that they can do with them what they want. That's a very negative way of characterizing it. But at the moment you show there are many great checks and balances. For example, the electorate or the broader public in the case of killer robots, or the general public and people participating when it comes to sharing culture, that makes it significantly easier to show that it's actually a positive thing that many people like. So I think that's the first couple of things to look at, whether people can actually properly consent into it and what accountability is. I think the second thing, and this is of course generally good debating advice, but I think it works specifically well in terms of trends, is simply to talk about what, and this is very often forgotten. So I think the sharing culture is a very interesting question because you have the very easy example of people having made paintings of themselves. It's also a more crucial example, for example, diaries and people meeting up with their friends. It isn't the case that people didn't share anything for the rise of the sharing culture. That is something that has generally been done and something that will keep happening. So you need to be very clear on the comparative, and I think that is something you can frame in multiple ways. So, for example, at the moment you say the comparative is a world in which individuals are more independent and don't care significantly less about what other people think of them. I think at the moment you manage to lay out that and to make that intuitive, you have a good shot of winning the debate and saying it's a very negative thing. But if you're opposition and you say, well, you have the same craving for attention and the same craving for confirmation without sharing culture, the problem is significantly harder to access and it's for more privileged people. Whereas the sharing culture democratizes that and makes sure everyone can have that confirmation, everyone can have the happiness. I think that's a great case for all. So I think on the both sides of the house, there's you can definitely do it, but be very clear and very explicit about what you think the comparative is and try to make it as intuitive as possible. And I think the same way that when you talk about killer robots, many people talk about the advantages or disadvantages about these kind of lead autonomous robots. I think almost as important is simply the comparative. In this case, probably going to be soldiers or like regular warfare. What are the issues with that? Is it relatively well functioning? And are these people making an effort to win hearts and minds? Or does people have all kinds of human errors and keep failing? And then loads of analysis to be done there. Both these are important in characterizing these lead autonomous robots and making sure your side is better or worse. But make sure to think about the comparative and to give loads of reasons on why that is true as well. Cool. Are there any questions about this? I'm going to check the channel. No? Cool. Then we move on to the second one. So the second, about actors. So it's really important to understand that in almost every motion, certain actors are involved and that you're going to need these actors to cooperate or that you need to create an accountability measure for these kind of actors. But almost all of our debates about people, and those people don't always do what we want. So I picked out two motions to highlight this. The first one is, this House believes that Western institutions should neither cooperate with nor use the data produced by non-Western medical institutions that do not meet Western standards in human clinical trials. The second one is, this House believes that states should significantly fund female-only tech companies. I think in both of these motions, there's a bunch of actors that need to be analyzed and a bunch of actors that you need to, of which you need to make intuitive that they're going to behave in a certain way. What do we mean with that? So I think the first thing you're going to look at when you have this kind of motion in which an actor plays a certain role is the incentive these actors have under the status quo. So, for example, when we talk about the medical institutions that do this kind of research that doesn't uphold the Western standards, I think at the moment you can make intuitive that they're doing their best to make a scientific contribution and that they're creating all this kind of excellent data. They're between Americans just ignoring these kinds of rights. Then obviously that's a very useful data that we should probably be using. At the moment you say, no, this is direct exploitation, which doesn't necessarily create good data, but are purely commercially driven, create this kind of bad data. I think at the moment you're directly doing that. That is a very good way to make intuitive. That's actually that. I see that one comment was deleted. Feel free to type it again if it does a legit question. Otherwise, I'm just going to move on. So I think that's the first thing you can do. And I think the same goes at the moment you're talking about these actors, where they're going to participate. So at the moment, you make very intuitive that the tech sector is incredibly sexist, that's unlikely to get any meaningful progress without any kind of state intervention. Probably this is a very good idea, if only for the reason that the comparative is inherently problematic. It's the only way to get any kind of real progress. As at the moment you say, look, currently it's going relatively well, and we're having a relatively proper kind of development, a proper kind of process towards a less sexist tech sector. Then your harms, for example, women being drawn to these companies from other kind of companies, are going to be made significantly more important and significantly more intuitive. So I think the first thing is look at these actors. What incentives do they have under the status quo? Where you can, for example, talk about the profit sector when it's about companies, or you can talk about people not being accountable. So that's the first question you should actually ask yourself. The second question then, quite intuitively, what incentives do the motion create for these kind of actors? So for example, when it comes to these companies, at the moment you can say, or they have to completely shut down, or they have to go on. I think that's probably a bad reason to stop using their data. Whereas at the moment you can make intuitive that they actually improve and will not try to do the best to uphold the best standards. That makes it far more intuitive that things actually get better and you get a proper kind of development. So what kind of incentive do you actually give it? Once again, you should make this intuitive by talking about profit and talking about other kinds of issues. And I think the same goes for the second motion. If you can make intuitive that they will now hire more women and they will get more important positions, that will be directly better. Whereas at the moment you say they're going to hire less women, or women are going to have a less important position in the workplace. Make intuitive, that's actually going to be worse. I think very important thing to keep in mind here is that motions might create incentives. They're not always the incentives you want to have. So a very good question to ask yourself is any kind of perverse incentives will create it, anything might go wrong there. One of my favorite examples for this is this house will make teacher salaries partly dependent on the grades their kids get in class. It's often done at the school's level, but I think it's a really good motion. And then, of course, a prop team will stand up and say, now teachers will work harder and make sure people actually get better grades. I think a very good argument is that you now give teachers a perverse incentives to go to schools that are already better. That might not something that teams directly think of, but always realize that people are necessarily nice and that they might not necessarily cooperate in the sense that the motion will give an incentive, but not necessarily the proper incentive. Before you move on, there's a question. I'm going to read out the question. Hi, I want to ask how you make sure that your explanation that you offer for a certain extent of comparative is just enough without overdoing it or undergoing it. I think that's an excellent question. I think it's also a hard question to answer. I think there are a couple of things you can keep in mind. I think the first thing is whether you think something is going to be contested. As I've outlined, I think in many cases it should be contested, but keep in mind that there are quite some cases in which something is simply ignored or you think the opposition is going to attack it. So the first thing is to explain in a very strategic way and simply expect what is going to be attacked and spend loads of analysis and loads of time on those specific links and sort of spend less time on the things that you think that are largely going to be uncontested. I think the second thing that you need to keep in mind is to only talk about the relevant aspects of the trend. So often you see that many people spend a lot of time discussing every possible aspect of a trend and talking about a lot, even if it isn't necessarily relevant to their arguments or to the arguments on the other side. That's of course a massive shame. So be very specific in terms of the mechanisms that you want to talk about, and if the mechanisms are directly required, and spend slightly less time on the others. So definitely those two things to keep in mind. Other than that, I do think this is mainly, and I know this is a lame answer, but I think this is something that mainly comes with experience. So be very careful, especially because judges aren't always as specific about it, but try to get a grasp of in which debate you did prove your context to a significant amount and in which debate you didn't prove your context to a significant amount. This will probably help you build up the experience. I think the analogy here is with the analysis you need to provide for every argument, where you see freshers heavily over-analyzing or heavily under-analyzing almost everything. Whereas at the moment you get more experience, you start to develop a certain feeling, a certain intuition on when you have properly explained something and when it actually needs more analysis. I think you should actually get the same for context and characterization. But of course, it only happens at the moment you start paying attention to it and start actually try to become aware of it. So I think that's the thing. I hope this is a satisfactory answer. Cool. So I'm going to move on. So to wrap up talking about actors, I think it's very important to simply look at the incentive different kind of actors have under the status quo and explain why those lead them to do good or bad things. And then talk about whether you change these incentives and whether you change them in a good or in a bad way. a specific attention to perverse incentives, where companies or people might actually get a different incentive from the motion, but not in the way that you actually want them to have, but in a way which is more harmful. So the last thing I want to talk about is being talked about most. I'm going to be very short about it, but I think it's also important is to characterize the groups you're helping. In many cases, debating simply comes down to which group we want to help or which group we want to prioritize and which group is most important. So picked out two examples. This house believes that LGBT groups should actively seek to include side B Christians. For those who don't know, side B Christians, there was an info slide which is also online, but it basically means people are homosexual and believe that to be sinful, but are also open about their identity and are Christian. The second motion is this house would allow local governments to issue working visa for special minimum wage. I was kicked out on the motion, so I probably shouldn't speak about it with too much authority, but I think had I better listen to my own workshop, the chance of me being kicked out would have been significantly less. So there's definitely a lesson to be told there. So when it comes to this group, I think as outlined, the main thing you want to do is to outline that your group is the group you want to help. And therefore, as your challenge is to make the group as sympathetic and as important as possible. And there are a bunch of things that make your group more intuitively vulnerable, more intuitively sympathetic. What are those? So firstly, I know the term is being overused, but I think it's important, is to talk about vulnerability and saying my group is the saddest, my group is the one that is hurt most and is most problematic. For example, when it relates to the first motion, I think you can talk about internalized oppression by side B Christians, what it means to believe you live your life in a very sinful way, but also talk about the community and explain there's loads of oppression there. But of course, you can do the reverse for LGBT groups, saying that many LGBT people are barely out of the closet or if they are still being massively oppressed. So, of course, both sides are very vulnerable, but I think you can come up with ways of why group is specifically vulnerable and therefore portray your group as the most sympathetic, the one most in direct need of her help. I think the second thing you can do, and it's important here, is the extent to which people actually have a choice. So at the moment when people have no choice whatsoever, they're of course incredibly vulnerable. Whereas at the moment people have some degree of choice and some degree of autonomy, we generally find them to be slightly less sympathetic. I think an analogy here would be, for example, prisoners and victims, whereas most debaters and in most debates is justifiably a certain kind of degree for prisoners, but most people find victims even more sympathetic given the fact that victims didn't have any degree of choice at all. So at the moment you can make intuitive that at least people have some control, some kind of organization, some kind of autonomy that makes it more likely that they will be portrayed as sympathetic. Of course, you'll be careful that you will not get into victim blaming here or blame people for their own choice, but generally outlining that the other group, to the other side, has to defend as a sort of kind of autonomy does work really well in portraying them relatively less sympathetic. The last thing is, I think, most intuitive, but also important. If a group is doing harm, even if they do not consent in doing that harm or don't do it on purpose, we generally portray them as less sympathetic. And I think this is what makes the side B Christian motion very interesting. At the moment, you directly see, look, side B Christians, even though they're present because they believe homosexuality is harmful, even if they don't try to do it, and even if they don't have the intention to do it, they are likely to create harms to lots of people in the sense that they make them feel even more unsafe, make them feel even more vulnerable. That's, of course, a tragic and problematic thing. So they're probably not the group you're going to help. So watch out here that even if you don't consent in doing a certain kind of harm, I think showing that someone is doing a certain kind of harm and creating that is a very good way to make intuitive that it should be helped. So try to keep that in mind as well. And if you can show that the group is harmful in any meaningful presence, then the argument goes further that they're simply being harmful and that you can take away a certain kind of harm. That also makes the group as a whole less in need of your help and slightly less sympathetic. I think that's a massive difference if you can actually directly outline that. I think the general comment here is to always be comparative. So given the fact that you're in debating are almost always comparing to two or more groups and talking about those, be comparative and talk about the relative degree of vulnerability in cases where you're comparing to an incredibly vulnerable group, for example, the side B Christian motion, but also in cases where the groups you're talking about are relatively less vulnerable, explaining that one side is more in need of our help and one side is more deserving of our sympathy is, I think, a really great way to make your arguments. There's one specific application I would like to outline here. There are many modes in which you weigh off an individual, a vulnerable individual, versus an individual group. So, for example, when it comes to individuals coming out, even if that might have great cost to them, might help the movement in the long term. I think then making very intuitive how vulnerable such an individual is, and that even if they are helped, their individual good shouldn't be sacrificed for the greater good, is a very intuitive way of directly doing that. I hope I'm clear here. So basically to talk about basically the argument about sacrifice, which say, look, the cost we are inflicting upon this individual and what we're doing to them is completely unjustified, is something that we can do, even if the progress on their side is so great. I think especially running that kind of analysis and that kind of argumentation, which is being done relatively often, it's very important to outline how big the harm to them is and how much sympathy we should have to them and why they are the most important group. Cool. I'm going to look whether there are any questions. No. Not yet. Cool. Then, I was once told that a good workshop should never take more than half an hour. So that was been sort of aiming towards, and it looks like I'm going to make that. So I think those are the three categories in which actually should and could contextualize. One talking about a certain trend or a certain phenomenon. One talking about certain actors, and three talking about groups you're helping and portraying them in the most sympathetic way. Then there's a bunch of remarks which you think are very often forgotten, especially by slightly more experienced team who know they need to contextualize and know need to characterize, but aren't doing it properly, which you want to talk about. So I think the most important thing is that you shouldn't just set up your own context or your own contextualization, but there are a couple of other things you should do as well. And these apply specifically in better debates, but I think they also apply in others. I get a very useful request where I can talk a little slower. I'm going to try that. Yes. So the first thing you should always forget is that you shouldn't just build up your own characterization and make that one intuitive, but also rebuild one of the others and actually deal with them. And I think a couple of very intuitive ways you can do that. I think the first one is actually look for inconsistencies in their characterization. It's a bit mean, but groups are, of course, very different and very diverse. So very often you will see that teams have a certain kind of inconsistency within their own kind of argumentation. So, for example, what very often happens in the debate about lead autonomous robots is a team talk about how expensive they are and that relatively, for example, poor nations or poor institutions don't really have access to them, but also say that it dramatically decrease the cost of war. I think you can say there's definitely a tension in there. Like either the costs are relatively low and most people can access them, or the other is true and the costs are incredibly high, but it also means that people aren't necessarily going to use them to plunge into war. So probably one of the two is true. But pointing out the inconsistency and saying there is a certain kind of inconsistency is, I think, a good way of dealing with another side's characterization and explaining why it's not necessarily most intuitive one and why yours is more intuitive. I think the second is to be very explicit in terms of to make a very explicit comparative in terms of credibility. So, and this often goes wrong where people say, look, there's a tension in their characterization, or this is the issue with their contextualization, but don't do the next step of that argument, which explain why theirs is better. So I think the best way of actually doing it is saying, look, opposition at the same time says, that these kind of lethal machines are very expensive and they're inaccessible, but also that it massively lowers the cost of war. We don't think no necessarily can be true. We gave you far more plausible characterization, being this, and this one. Also notice that it works really well in terms of second half. It is a knifing because both can to a certain extent be true on the both sides, or you simply call them even if. But it is a very good way of showing that you are the better side of the debate, given the fact that you actually have a consistent characterization, whereas the other side doesn't. So I think making that comparative very explicit is a very good way of doing it. And I think the third one in general, when you rebut a certain one, be incredibly explicit. I think the best speeches often start by first I want to deal with their characterization. Don't try to integrate it or just say in your rebuttal, but say that you're going to deal with it very explicit is a very good way of doing it. Why? Well, because many judges don't really pick up on it. Like the whole point of this workshop is make you aware that you should talk and think more about characterization than we generally doing. And I think this also applies to judges who often let it factor into the judging, but then aren't making very explicit or aren't aware of the role it directly plays. I think being very explicit to the judges in what you're doing and explaining why important it is makes sure you get far more credit for the good stuff you're doing in terms of inconsistencies. So I think that's a piece of advice in terms of dealing with the kind of inconsistency, dealing in the kind of the inconsistencies, make a very explicit comparative, and generally look for inconsistencies. Cool. There are a couple of questions. I'm going to start with the first one. What is the role of contextualization within second speaker speeches? How much can you do it in a with speech for a standard in order to emphasize the importance of an argument? I think that's a really good question. My answer to that, so when it comes to deputy speeches, of course, any kind of new material is allowed. And I think deputy is one of the best speeches to do lots of contextualization in. The reason for that is that the PM gives a lot of material and the low bunch drops a lot of material. And then, of course, judges have a very hard time identifying it. Starting with the contextualization and the context to place it in enables you to, not having to deal with each of the material of the other speaker individually, but also make sure your own material stands stronger and that you're winning that clash. When it comes to with speech, it's slightly different. I think it depends a bit on the kind of contextualization you're talking about. So what a with speaker definitely might do is explain why their group is the most important one and is the most crucial one. That is something they definitely might do and they definitely should do. And it comes, for example, about talking about certain actors and allocated kind of purpose incentive. You do run the risk of becoming too new and then too much new stuff. So to be very careful in that extent. So there it differs on the kind of characterization. I think when it comes to rebuttal, for example, pointing out inconsistency, but also other kind of rebuttals, in terms of characterization, that is something a whip speaker can do and definitely should do. I think these are often the strongest whip speeches in which the team looks very strong, but you can talk about their characterization, explain why it's fundamentally flawed or inconsistent, and you can make sure a case falls as a whole. Also notice, and I think this is especially relevant for the whip speeches, that characterizations enable you to weigh off halves in a very good way. So explain why your case the more credible one is a very good way to frame out the first half. I think in whip speeches at the moment it's new is definitely a very useful thing. I hope that answered the question. The second question is, if you don't weigh off the tension in their contextualizations with your own, maybe yours isn't as clear as in that. So do you simply, as a judge, you do it? The one mentions first tense. I think that's a very good question. I think the answer to that is harder than that. So I'm gonna start. I think how most judges it approaches, regardless of whether that's a good thing, when it comes to contextualizations, what they basically do is they get the middle way and say, well, probably both or two to a certain extent. I think that's a cowardice way that can sometimes be annoying, but it is something that many judges do. I think at the moment you're speaking, it's always worth pointing out the tension, given the fact that it's there and explains why their characterization is incredibly unlikely and incredible. So it's always worth pointing out, but I think it does need the second step, mainly because it is intuitive. I do think at the moment you spot that yours isn't as clearly set up and you need it, you should basically fill in the hole analysis there and actually start doing it, start implementing it, given the fact that you need that kind of clarity. Midway to the response, as you often have with POIs, I realized I might have slightly misunderstood the question, so I hope this answered it. If it isn't, please type it again or elaborate upon it, because I would love to answer it properly. While waiting for that, I'm going to move on. So that's in terms of rebuttal. I think the next step then is talking about even if. So the point is that many characterizations often have a certain kind of truth, and even if there's a tension in there, even if you have a good reasons why theirs isn't necessarily true, there is a certain kind of truth in there. So that's why, other than just dealing with characterization and rebutting it, I do think it's very important to, even if rebuttals, even if their characterization is true, this is why we're still winning the debate. And I think there are two things you can directly do there. I think the first one is talking about why that characterization is less important, and more specifically here, why the characterization affects a smaller group than yours. So acknowledging that it might be true to a certain extent, and that a certain amount of people might actually be affected, but saying that that group is going to be smaller. So for example, when it is about side B Christians, I think a good way of doing it is saying, look, we acknowledge that there might be a certain amount of people who are going to say harmful things and going to make people feel unsafe. However, we think that group is going to be incredibly small for reasons X and Y, whereas the group we are talking about, kind of side B Christians, which are simply looking for a warm welcome, need a bunch of help, are the significantly bigger group for reason X and Y. So they acknowledge that there might be kind of truth in the characterization, but say it only applies to a very small group, and it's only true to a limited extent, whereas ours is significantly bigger. So this is basically explaining why it is less important doing that. I think the second thing, and this is very important one that's often forgotten, is it often worth explaining why your argumentation still stands, even if the characterization of the other side is true. So saying, look, we acknowledge that a certain amount of people might not actually participate or aren't going to be as helpful as you should be. However, we think we can still force them, or even if they participate reluctantly, they're still going to participate to a certain extent. You see, good teams often do this really well, and I think it's a very important thing. So just explain it, even if you get the characterization that isn't yours, explain why that argumentation is still standing and still works really well. Cool, yeah, excellent. So the last thing, relatively intuitive, I want to talk about is weighing. So like everything in debating, I think characterizations have to be weighed. And I think coming back to the question I asked earlier, especially in with pieces is important. At the end of a really good debate, often multiple characterizations will be true. That's to say that it might apply to different kinds of people or in different situations. Then, of course, you need to weigh them. And I think there are two things you can weigh them on. This might sound intuitive, but they're often being forgotten, and they are being very important. I think the first thing you want to look at is plausibility. Explain, look, ours is more plausible for reasons X and Y. This basically comes down what I've said before, but I think it's worth mentioning explicitly that it's useful to weigh off a certain kind of context and explain why yours is more plausible, and therefore the more important one, the one you should care more about. The second one is a bit new, but I think you can talk about the consequences of a certain characterization being true and use that to weigh them. They're saying, look, it might be true that some teachers aren't going to participate. We don't really care about it, given the fact that we don't think there's a lot of harm in it. However, at the moment they choose to participate, there are massive benefits here, and talk about that. And I think being aware of this also helps you making your own arguments, because you then realize that you don't only need to explain why your characterization is the right one, but also why that is so important, why the consequences are either really beneficial or really bad at the moment people don't listen to it. I think so I think that's an important thing to do. Sorry, I got some background with here. Excellent. So I'm going to check if there are any more questions and then probably rehab. So, as said before, I think there are, roughly speaking, three kinds of broad categories you can characterize. The first thing you can do is evaluate a certain trend, and you're mainly doing that by the actors involved, looking at the actors involved, why they're doing, who are doing this, and why. The second thing you can look at is the comparative. What would happen if this trend of this phenomenon wouldn't exist? The second thing you do is look at actors. You talk about the incentives certain actors have on the status quo, and you look at the incentives these kind of actors have on the motion. Lastly, you're going to try to portray your group in as sympathetic way as possible, where you talk about vulnerability, the extent of choice and autonomy they have, and the amount of harm. Regardless of this whole, always don't forget to rebut the other side, deal with even if characterizations, and try to weigh off different contexts. I think I made the 30-minute marks. I'm going to stay around for about a minute to see if there's any questions. As said before, feel free to contact me. I love to chat about this. Thanks a lot for watching, and good luck in your debating careers.